Move to questions without notice. Are there any questions? I give the call to the Honourable the Leader of the Opposition.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. Prime Minister, you've completely mishandled your Canberra Voice proposal, and it's increasingly clear that the Voice referendum is not going to deliver the moment of national unity that the 1967 referendum delivered. How can you in good conscience drive the country to a divisive referendum on October 14? As the writs are yet to be issued, will the Prime Minister withdraw his Voice referendum so that we can avoid an outcome which sets back reconciliation and divides the nation?
The Treasurer will cease interjecting. The Prime Minister has the call.
Mr Speaker, well, I established a timetable that was very clear for this process. And if people examined the parliamentary sitting timetable, they could have worked out the date as well of the referendum when it was due to be held. I said that we would work through the referendum working group and the constitutional advisory group to develop the legislation that was introduced into this House in March, and then we had a parliamentary committee examine that for June. Before that process, indeed before even the March date, of course, last year, the National Party declared their opposition, and before the parliamentary committee process went through, the Liberal Party declared their opposition. But the Leader of the Opposition sat on this side of the chamber and voted for the legislation, as did a majority of senators vote for the legislation. And under the legislation, the referendum must be held between 2 months and 33 days and 6 months from the passing of that legislation, which was, of course, passed in June. I announced, so as to give people more notice than was necessary, the October 14 date. The referendum will take place on that date, and Australians will get to determine their view on that date. The Leader of the Opposition, of course, has since then committed to, if he's ever elected Prime Minister, to have another referendum if this referendum is defeated. So he wants this debate to just go on ad infinitum, in spite of the fact that a majority of the process occurred under the former government. It was the former government that established a process under Tony Abbott. It was the former government that appointed Tom Calma and Marcia Langton. It was the former government that appointed Julian Leeser and Pat Dodson to chair the Joint Parliamentary Inquiry. This Leader of the Opposition...
Members on my left
This
will cease
Leader of the Opposition speaks about division when he appointed the member for Barara as his Indigenous Affairs spokesperson and Shadow Attorney General. I took that as a very positive sign, given the record of the member for Barara on this going back more than a decade. It's unfortunate that the Leader of the Opposition has chosen politics over substance.
Concluded. Give the call to the Leader of the Australian Greens.
Thank you, Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. Can the Prime Minister update the House on additional funding for public and community housing he's agreed to with the Greens today to ensure that the Housing Australia Future Fund bill passes the Senate this week?
Give the call to the Prime Minister.
Thanks, Mr Speaker. I thank the Leader of the Greens for his question. And I am indeed very pleased that the Housing Australia Future Fund now has majority support in the Senate. With the Australian Labor Party, the Australian Greens and all the crossbenchers from the Jackie Lambie Party as well as Senator Pocock all declaring their support like crossbenchers did for social and community housing to be built in this country. We have a comprehensive housing plan. $10 billion for the HAP. It includes 30,000 additional social and affordable homes, including for women and children escaping domestic violence, including for veterans and including to fix up remote housing. In addition to that, we have our $2 billion social housing accelerator that we announced in June. In addition to that, we've announced a new national target to build 1.2 million homes over 5 years and the $3 billion
the manager
new
of opposition
homes
business will cease interjecting.
so that state governments get homes built. In addition to that, with National Cabinet, we've announced a better deal for renters. And today we have committed an additional $1 billion in funding for the National Housing Infrastructure Facility to build more homes for Australians who need them. More homes for Australians who need them. And I thank the crossbenchers in this chamber and in the other chamber for joining with the Labor government to make sure this is done. Now, this is the last of the commitments that I made in budget replies to put into legislation. We spent our time in opposition developing good policy that will become good programs in government. Cheaper childcare in place from July 1. The National Reconstruction Fund in place. Fixing aged care. Rewiring
the Leader of the Nationals will cease interjecting.
All of these plans now put in place.
Member for Deakin.
We developed policy in opposition to deliver it in government, and that is what we are doing, working for Australia each and every day. And I thank the Leader of the Greens for the constructive discussions that we have had.
Order.
That we have had. The coalition, obsessed as they are with just saying no to everything, are the great irrelevancy in Australian politics today. They marginalise themselves, they sit in the corner and just say no to everything because that is just their response. The coalition of yesterday turned into the coalition of today, obsessed with their negativity.
Order. Before I call the Deputy Leader of the Opposition, there is far too much noise in the chamber. We are not having a repeat of last week. The member for Deakin and the member for Barker will leave the chamber under 94A. We are simply not going to have continual interjections. Give the call to the Honourable the Deputy Leader of the Opposition. Order.
My question is to the Prime Minister. Did the Prime Minister or his office provide any direction, information or advice to Minister King or her office at any time prior to the minister's decision to block Qatar Airways' application for additional flights?
Give the call to the Prime Minister.
I thank the Deputy Leader for her question. Now, this was a decision to change nothing that occurred. And one of the things that I do is, as Prime Minister, is I haven't appointed myself to other jobs. To other jobs. I trust my ministers to make decisions. I'm not also the Transport Minister. I'm not also the Treasurer. I'm not also the Education
the Prime
Minister.
Minister will return to the question.
I'm not also the Health Minister. And let's have a look at what this decision is.
Order.
And look at the history. See if you see a pattern here. In 2007, Qatar Airways had 7 flights as a result of a decision by Mark Vaile as the Minister to the gateway airports, which is where the air services agreements come from. Then in 2009, that went to 14 flights as a result of a decision that I made. So 7 to 14. In 2015, it went to 21 flights.
Order. The Prime Minister will pause and I'll hear from the Leader of the Opposition.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker. It's on relevance. The Prime Minister was asked, did the Prime Minister or his office provide any direction, information or advice to Minister King or her office at any time prior to the Minister's decision in relation to Qatar? Now, Mr Speaker—
Resume your seat. I understand the point of order. Resume your seat. Order. On the point of order, the Leader of the House.
To the point of order, the question, as it was just read out by the Leader of the Opposition, goes to what was the chronology before the decision was made. That's what it goes to. That's what it asks for, and that's what the Prime Minister is providing.
I just want to deal with this. Order. I just want to deal with this issue, as I suspected it would come up again today. Order. My role is to interpret the standing orders as they are written, and it's not to vouch for any accuracy or a yes-no answer about what is required or what would be desired. The standing orders 104A is very clear. An answer must be directly relevant to the question. I repeat, directly relevant to the question. Not a direct answer, as the Leader of the Opposition I'm sure would like, but directly relevant to the question. So the Prime Minister was asked about the decision and the timeline. He is entitled to talk about the decision, but I'll remind the Prime Minister to remain directly relevant to the question. Prime Minister has the call.
Thanks, Mr Speaker. So it went from 7 to 14 in 2009. 2015, it went to 21.
Order. The Leader of the Opposition
and then
will cease interjecting.
And then it went, after a 4-year period, from a 2018 application to 2022, it went up by 7. Up by 7. From 21
Order.
to 28.
The member for Fairfax.
From 21 to 28. So the minister made the decision. I trust my ministers to make decisions that they're responsible for. This was the normal course of events. As a former Transport Minister, I know I would have had 3 or 4 of these applications before me at any time and make decisions appropriately.
Has the Prime Minister concluded his answer? The member for Gilmore has the call.
My question is to the Minister for Housing and Homelessness. Why is it important that the Housing Australia Future Fund pass the Parliament?
Call to the order. Give the call to the Minister for Housing, the Minister for Homelessness and the Minister for Small Business.
Thanks, Mr Speaker, and I thank the member for Gilmore for all of her work regarding the Housing Australia Future Fund. She knows how important it is that this bill actually pass the Parliament. She knows how important it is for every Australian that needs a safe, affordable place to call home. Indeed, passing this bill for the Parliament is important for women and children fleeing family and domestic violence. It is important for older women at risk of homelessness, because 4,000 of the 30,000 social and affordable homes that this fund will build in the first 5 years will be going to those groups, as well as $100 million for crisis and transitional housing options for women. It is also important that this bill pass the House for Indigenous communities. $200 million for the repair, maintenance and improvement of their housing will be available in the first 5 years of the fund. Yeah. It's also important for the veterans who are experiencing homelessness, who are at risk of homelessness, because $30 million will be available to build and house and fund special services in the first 5 years for those veterans. Yeah. But, Mr Speaker, it's critically important for the community housing providers who have already done the work to get as many homes on the ground as quickly as they can once this bill passes the Parliament. And of course it's important news for future generations who will benefit from having a fund there in perpetuity to build social and affordable homes. This $10 billion Housing Australia Future Fund is the single biggest investment from a federal government in more than a decade in social and affordable housing in this country. For the first time, the Commonwealth Government will have a legislative mandate to finance and support social and affordable housing right across the country. It will be there in perpetuity, not just for this government, not just the first 5 years of the fund, but there in perpetuity with returns going into social and affordable housing. This will change housing in Australia. It will benefit so many Australians. We have worked tirelessly to deliver this bill because we understand the long-term reform required to turn around the housing challenges that we inherited from those opposite, Mr Speaker. But this is about people. And I want to thank the members in this place who understand that. The members of the crossbench who have joined us, the member for Bass even, of course now the Greens. We are getting this done together because it's important for people on the ground. It has always been about people. People who are waiting for social and affordable homes across this country. I look forward to seeing this bill pass the Parliament, for working for all Australians, but particularly those doing it tough and getting on with the job of delivering more homes for Australians that need it. Yeah.
Before I call the honourable member for Brisbane, I'm pleased to inform the House that present in the gallery today is His Excellency Mr Jamie Shomali, the Ambassador of Chile. On behalf of the House, I extend a warm welcome to you. Give a call to the honourable member for Brisbane.
Thank you, Speaker. My question is to the Environment Minister. A new report by the UN has concluded that meeting the goals of the Paris Climate Agreement to limit warming to 1.5 degrees will require phasing out all fossil fuels. So why have you given approval to several coal projects since becoming minister?
Order. Members on my right will cease interjecting. Give the call to the Minister for the Environment and Water.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr Speaker. And I think I've had pretty much the same question each week recently. And perhaps if I go into some of the details about how these decisions are made, I've been very clear with the Parliament about our government's determination to achieve net zero in Australia. I've made it very clear the measures that we're taking: 82% renewable energy, a target of 82% renewable energy, the fact that we are committed to net zero, we've got a trajectory to net zero. But on the issue of approvals, I think it's really very important to say this. The Greens political party knows that emissions from coal and gas projects are covered by the Climate Minister's safeguard mechanism to make sure that all big polluters reduce their pollution.
Order.
Now, the reason that the Greens political party should know about the safeguard mechanism is that they spent weeks negotiating it with the Climate Change Minister, the Climate and Energy Minister. They negotiated the safeguard mechanism, they voted for it, they've defended it. They say they believe in the safeguard mechanism as a way of getting Australia to net zero, and yet, having negotiated it, defended it and voted for it, they now think that the Climate Minister should do something different to what the Environment Minister does. So you have two separate approval mechanisms, one on climate and energy and one on environment. It simply makes no sense. The Greens political party voted for a law to get emissions down. It's the safeguard mechanism. All new projects are assessed against that safeguard mechanism. That's what you agreed to. That's what you voted for. That's what we're doing. That's what we'll keep doing because we're committed to getting to net zero.
Call to the honourable member for Macnamara.
Thank you very much, Speaker. My question is to the Treasurer. How is the Albanese Labor government delivering more homes for Australians, and how will this help strengthen the economy?
Call to the Treasurer.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I acknowledge and thank the member for Macnamara, a champion for his whole community, but particularly for the substantial amount of renters in the electorate of Macnamara. This is a really important day for housing policy in this country. After months of delay, the Housing Australia Future Fund will now be locked in legislation. This is the biggest investment in social and affordable housing for more than a decade. I pay tribute to the Prime Minister, to the Housing Minister, and I thank the crossbench for getting on board as well so that we can make this progress together. I pay tribute in particular. The Housing Minister, with her characteristic humility a month ago, took none of the credit for the substantial amount of work that the Minister for Housing does in this area. This is not just a big win for the government. Much more importantly than that, it is a big win for Australians who desperately need more homes to be built. And this will mean an extra 30,000 homes for people who desperately need them, often the most vulnerable people in our communities, Mr Speaker.
Order.
Now, housing costs are such a big and important part of the cost of living pressures that people are facing. To put it bluntly, there are not enough homes and rents are too high. And that's why the government is focused on a broad and ambitious housing agenda and why the passage of the Housing Australia Future Fund is absolutely critical. It sits alongside, as the Minister said, our Housing Accord, the Social Housing Accelerator, and also the biggest increase in Commonwealth rent assistance in 3 decades, Mr Speaker. Billions of dollars being invested into the housing challenge we have in our economy and in our society. Building more homes, more supply, taking some of the edge off rents while we do that with that Commonwealth rent assistance increase. Mr Speaker, this is another way that we are addressing the serious cost of living pressures that people are facing in a way that takes some of the edge off inflation rather than add to the inflationary pressures that we have in our economy. We understand that people are under pressure. We understand that housing is a big part of that, and that's why today's progress is so important. This is how we work for Australia to build more homes despite the angry and nasty negativity that we see from those opposite.
Give a call to the Leader of the Nationals.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. On what date was the Prime Minister or his office first informed of Minister King's decision to block the application for additional flights to and from Australia by Qatar Airways?
Order. The Minister for the Environment and Water is warned. The Prime Minister has the call.
Thanks very much, Mr Speaker. As I indicated to Parliament last week, I was informed by the Minister for Transport after I had a discussion with the Virgin CEO, which was on the 13th of July. Now, the idea that I'm at a NATO summit and the Minister for Transport thinks she'll ring me up or contact me to tell me that nothing is happening it's just bizarre. It's just bizarre. It's just bizarre. You know, I can also confirm the Environment Minister didn't ring me up to tell me nothing was happening. The Treasurer didn't ring me up to tell me nothing was happening. The Education Minister didn't ring me up to tell me that nothing was happening. And the Energy Minister didn't ring me up to tell me he was still sticking with net zero by 2050. I mean, this shows,
the Leader of the
this shows how bereft they are of any real issues. This is a status quo, nothing decision being made. Nothing decision to keep exactly the same thing that was put in place just 1 year ago. Just 1 year ago. And the idea that this was front and centre while I was at the NATO summit discussing a land war in Europe, with all of the global inflationary consequences that were going on is quite frankly absurd.
Order. Members on my left, when the House comes to order, I'll hear from the member for Chisholm.
Thanks so much, Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Social Services. How will the Housing Australia Future Fund support vulnerable or disadvantaged Australians, particularly women? Why is it important this bill passes the Parliament?
The call to the Minister for Social Services.
Well, thank you, Speaker, and I'd like to thank the member for Chisholm for her question and her passion that she has in providing affordable housing for her electorate and indeed right around the country. Now, the Albanese government has made housing affordability and supply a priority since forming government last year. Now, this approach, of course, is in stark contrast to those opposite who in government and who now in opposition continue to show a lack of interest in housing policy. Now, through the Albanese government's action, we are supporting vulnerable and disadvantaged Australians through our $2 billion social housing accelerator, which will deliver thousands of new social homes across Australia. Our government took steps last year to unlock over $575 million from the National Housing Infrastructure Facility to deliver more social and affordable housing. And of course, this government is making the largest increase to Commonwealth rent assistance in over 30 years, benefiting more than 1 million low-income households, including pensioners, families, veterans, job seekers and students. And now, with agreement of the passage of the Housing Australia Future Fund legislation, this fund will now unlock extra housing stock that will benefit Australians, particularly women. Now, we know that violence against women and children is a leading cause of homelessness in Australia, which is why we've committed through the Housing Australia Future Fund to deliver $100 million over the first 5 years for crisis and transitional housing options for women and children. In addition to this investment in crisis and transitional housing, the HAF will also facilitate 4,000 new long-term homes for women and children impacted by family and domestic violence and older women at risk of homelessness. Now, these investments from the Housing Australia Future Fund also complement our work to build more emergency accommodation for women and children through our Safe Places program. Our government has delivered already around 270 new emergency accommodation places under the Safe Places program, assisting up to 1,604 women and children. Of course, now with the passage of the HAF legislation, we will be able to accelerate this investment, providing more crisis accommodation for more women and children, for older women in particular, so that they have a place to call home.
The call to the honourable member for Hume.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Infrastructure and Transport. The Minister has said she consulted with ministerial colleagues prior to her decision to reject the application for more flights by Qatar Airways. Last week, the Trade Minister said the Minister did not consult with him. The Deputy Prime Minister said the Minister did not consult with him. Which colleagues did the Minister consult with?
Give a call to the Minister for Order. The Treasurer will cease interjecting, and so will the member for Hume, or both will be warned. Give the call to the Minister for Infrastructure, Transport, Regional Development and Local Government.
Thanks very much to the member for Hume for the question. And as I said in Parliament last week, I consulted with relevant colleagues, as is the normal and proper process. But can I make it very, very clear, yet again, that the decision was mine. I am the Transport Minister, and in the same way, in exactly the same way that the previous Transport Minister has had before him decisions about whether to increase Qatar Airlines access under their bilateral agreements, it is the decision of the Transport Minister. These are very normal decisions that come before Transport Ministers. And as I have said, again, I consulted with relevant colleagues, but the decision was mine.
I give the call to the member for Solomon.
Thanks, Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Veterans Affairs. What does the Albanese Labor government's Housing Australia Future Fund mean for Australian veterans?
Order. I give the call to the Minister for Veterans Affairs.
Thank you, Speaker, and I thank the member for Solomon for this important question and also acknowledge his commitment in his community and across the Northern Territory, indeed nationally, in supporting our veteran community across Australia, because combating veteran homelessness is a key priority for the Albanese government when it comes to delivering on a better future for veterans and families in Australia. Now, every year about 6,000 of our contemporary veterans are at risk of homelessness, and on census night there are about 1,500 Australian veterans who found themselves homeless. Veterans are 3 times more likely to experience homelessness than the general population. Frankly, that's not good enough. We have an obligation to look after those that have put on our uniform to protect Australia. And our government, in bringing forward the $10 billion Housing Australia Future Fund, is setting aside from that $30 million to assist veterans that are experiencing homelessness or are at risk of experiencing homelessness. This is fundamental for our veteran community. This will be helping those that might be encountering homelessness, but also improving the wraparound services that will support veterans and families when they need it so that they can avoid becoming homeless as well. We committed in the member for Solomon's electorate to the Scott Palmer Centre, which is a service that will support homeless veterans in the Northern Territory. But we need to do more at a national level. The Leave No Veteran Behind report said doing nothing is just not an option. The Housing Australia Future Fund, though, will be the single biggest investment in social and affordable housing by a federal government in more than a decade. And WIP will enable the $30 million of funding that we will be able to put towards supporting veterans who are experiencing homelessness or at risk of homelessness. And there are amazing organisations across Australia doing that work now and who want to be able to do more to support our veterans. And I know the RAF Association in Western Australia are moving forward with their program and looking to government to how they can receive more support. I went with the member for Jagga to visit the V Centre being built in her electorate and to meet with VASI RSL Care to look at the work that they are doing in supporting veterans that need transitional housing just the other week, and I thank her for having me for that visit. And of course I've been engaging with the member for Solomon and the work that he's doing with the CAV up there in Darwin to support the Scott Palmer Centre, working with the Northern Territory to make sure that we can bring this project to fruition. We see the problem, we have a solution, and we are now able to move forward with the Housing Australia Future Fund being legislated through this parliament. And can I say, if any veterans need support, I encourage them to contact Open Arms on 1800 011 046.
Call to the honourable member for Page.
Thank you, Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Infrastructure, Transport and Regional Development. I refer to the Minister's answers in question time last week in relation to her decision to block the application for additional flights to and from Australia by Qatar. In those answers, the Minister seemed unable to recall any discussions about this matter with Qantas, the principal financial beneficiary of this decision. And now that the Minister has had several days to refresh her memory, can the Minister update the House on any discussions with Qantas she had about this matter?
Give a call to the Minister for Infrastructure, Transport, Regional Development and Local Government.
Thank you very much. As I have said repeatedly, my department undertook consultations with the relevant aviation stakeholders, and I was well aware of different stakeholder views when I took the decision. Well aware of different stakeholders' views when I took the decision. I do routinely meet with the CEOs of all airlines, airports and peak bodies, and as I said, from my recollection, the main people lobbying my office and me about Qatar were from Virgin and a third party who contacted my office on behalf of Qatar. Again, from my recollection, the discussions I have had with Qantas recently have in the main been about their concerns about our closing the labour loophole legislation. The fact is that myself and my office has received more lobbying on behalf of Qatar Airways than we did on behalf of Qantas. It might not suit the narrative of those opposite, but that is what happened.
Give a call to the honourable member for Lingiari.
Thank you, Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. The Albanese Labor government has made serious and sustained engagement with our region a priority. What benefits is the Prime Minister's most recent engagement in the region bringing to Australia?
Give the call to the Prime Minister.
I thank the member for Lingiari for her question. And of course, last week we launched the report on Southeast Asia Economic Strategy to 2040, developed by Nicholas Moore. And I thank Mr Moore for it. We launched it in Jakarta. There were leading business people, including the new head of the Business Council of Australia, there with us in Jakarta. It was appropriate to do that. ASEAN represents two-way trade worth over $178 billion last year, 15% of Australia's trade, greater than either with the US or Japan. In the report, we announced as well 3 commitments that we have made. Funding to deal with investment deal teams, a Southeast Asia Business Exchange and two-way placements and an internships program for businesses at both ends. While in Indonesia as well, I had a bilateral meeting with President Widodo, and I can inform the House, and certainly the member for Lingiari has a great interest in this. As a result of that and the work of our officials, including in the Agriculture Department, Indonesia has lifted the restrictions which were there on live cattle exports, and they will restart following the decision of Malaysia. I thank my friend, President Joko Widodo. This is why you develop relationships, because it matters here. It matters to jobs. It matters to agriculture. It matters to industry as well. And I'm surprised that creates a sledge from those opposite. But I know that the leader of the National Party understands how important this industry is, and I would have thought.
The Prime Minister will pause. The Deputy Leader of the Opposition has had a very good go today. She's now warned, and she won't interject for the remainder of question time. Prime Minister has the call.
Thanks, Mr Speaker. This is important because with the live cattle export industry, by definition, you can't just find another market for it. So that's why it had to be developed and delivered really quickly, and that is why
The member for Hume.
That is why it was so important, a particularly important industry for Northern Australia, and I thank the member for Lingiari for her ongoing commitment. On top of that, the visit to the Philippines was very welcome. The first visit for 20 years. We signed and upgraded the relationship to a strategic partnership while I was there. There are more than 250 major Australian companies operating in the Philippines, and that will make an enormous difference. In the years ahead, one company, ASEN, is looking at, instead of $2 billion they have invested in solar energy here in Australia, lifting that to $6 billion over the next 3 years. Just one example of what can be achieved.
Give the call to the honourable member for Kooyong.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is for the Minister for Infrastructure. Minister, Australia lags behind on consumer protections for air travellers. The US, Canada and the EU all compensate passengers for delays and cancellations. We're a country of migrants. Issues with flights can be the difference between us seeing our family and not seeing them. When will Australia hold its airlines to account for ripping off Australians and improve consumer protections around our aviation industry?
Give the call to the Minister for Infrastructure, Transport, Regional Development and Local Government.
Can I thank very much the member for Kooyong, sorry, I nearly said Ryan then, my apologies for that, for her question. This is a really important issue, and I want to draw your attention particularly to the Green Paper that I launched last week. It is not good enough at the moment that we have got service standards as low as they are. It is not good enough that we have had people who are not able to get refunds for flights that they could not take because of cancellations during COVID. It is not good enough that people with disabilities cannot travel by air as freely as those without disabilities. It is why I have very deliberately, in the Green Paper, canvassed the issue around consumer protections. Whilst we have the Australian Consumer Law, which provides baseline protections for all consumers when it comes to goods and services they purchase, and that includes goods and services they purchase in aviation, aviation complaints are up. They've been up across the board for some time now, and it's why I would really commend the Green Paper to you. There are countries that have different levels of protections when it comes to aviation consumer rights, and exactly as the Green Paper states, we are seeking submissions on this very issue, and I look forward, which I'm sure, because she does this regularly on a range of policy matters, that the member for Kooyong will contribute constructively to that Green Paper process when it comes to consumer protections. But I do say really clearly, airlines need to do better when it comes to Australian consumers. I have been highly critical of Qantas for some time in relation to some of the a range of issues in relation to Qantas. They need to do better, but all airlines, all consumers in Australia deserve to have access to aviation. They deserve to have a decent aviation service, and that's what we're delivering through the Aviation White Paper.
The call to the member for Moreton.
Thank you, Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Communications. How is the Albanese Labor government working with charitable organisations to help families with school-aged children connect to the internet?
The call to the Minister for Communications.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and I thank the member for Moreton for his question, because he knows that in order for school students to succeed in the classroom and ultimately in our increasingly digital society, they must have access to good, reliable internet. In 2023, connectivity is essential to maximising educational opportunities, from undertaking research for an assignment to participating in virtual learning. That's why the Albanese government is taking practical action to ensure that families with school-aged children, regardless of their means or their postcode, are connected, and that cost of living pressures don't further worsen digital exclusion. And that's where the School Student Broadband Initiative comes in, a year of free NBN connectivity for up to 30,000 unconnected families with school-aged children. To reach these families who may benefit from this initiative, charitable organisations like YWCA Canberra have been key. The YWCA is one of the nominating charitable agencies supporting families to access this initiative. I was so pleased today to visit the YWCA and to hear about the important work they're doing to support families in the ACT, along with my colleague, the Assistant Minister for Competition, Charities and Treasury, Dr Lee. Charitable organisations have a strong understanding of their needs of local families in balancing cost of living pressures, and they have long-standing relationships with families who could benefit from the School Student Broadband Initiative. The CEO of YWCA Canberra, Frances Crimmins, and her great staff told us of the tangible benefits that accessing free broadband is already delivering for families. She described it as a great initiative to address the cost of living challenges for many families, and life-changing for one family in particular, a single mother and her 8 children who are all set to benefit from this free internet. As all members would recognise, Australian charities are vital in building stronger, fairer communities that are better places to live. They provide critical support to vulnerable members of our society, and I thank all of the charities and community organisations who've come on board to support the School Student Broadband program, including YWCA Canberra. I'm pleased, Mr Speaker, to inform the House that today more than 3,000 families without broadband at home are being connected to free internet, and over 20,000 vouchers for free connections have now been issued by NBN to nominating agencies and eligible families. Through this initiative, we're delivering real outcomes for Australian students, giving them the tools they need to succeed and prosper in the classroom and beyond.
Give the call to the honourable member for Durack.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. On what date was Mr Alan Joyce last at Kirribilli House, the Lodge, or on board the Prime Minister's private plane? And was the application for additional flights to and from Australia by Qatar Airways discussed?
I couldn't hear the last part of order. I couldn't hear the last part of it. I'm just going to ask the member for Durack to state the last part of the question.
Just the last part, sir?
Yeah.
And was the application for additional flights to and from Australia by Qatar Airways discussed?
I'll call the Prime Minister.
I'm asked about functions or dinner. When was Alan Joyce last at Kirribilli House or the Lodge, and what discussions took place? And what discussions took place there? The question should go to the member for Cook, because he has never been at Kirribilli or the Lodge on my watch, not once. The last time he was there, Scott Morrison was the Prime Minister of Australia. The Leader of the Opposition went on 2GB last week and just asserted this to be a fact. It is a lie. It was a lie from the Leader of the Opposition. And it is typical of what they have done.
Order. Members on my left.
Typical of what they have done, Mr Speaker, because they want to just make anything up. They sided with Qantas when it grounded its fleet in 2011 and locked out its workforce. We stood up for the workforce. They sided with Qantas when its major competitor Virgin collapsed into administration in 2020. They sided with Qantas when it sacked and outsourced thousands of its workforce. They delivered $2.7 billion in taxpayer support, including almost $900 million in JobKeeper, without putting in place any mechanism to get any funding back. You ask the question, get the answer.
Order, members. Members on my right. Order. We will cease the interjection. The Minister for Social Services is not helping, and neither is the member for Hume. So I'll hear from, because I want to hear from the Manager of Opposition Business.
Mr Speaker, on relevance, very specific question. At Kirribilli House, the Lodge, or on board the Prime Minister's private plane, on what date did he last have discussions with Mr Alan Joyce?
Yeah, order. I think the Prime Minister has made it clear about exactly what he's answering, and it is within line of what the question was asked about, and he's going to the discussions. But order is going to the issues that was also raised in the question, and give him the call.
Workers, Mr Speaker, we sided with the workers, the members of the Transport Workers Union. They sided, as they always do, with big business interests.
What do they do now on labour hire?
And what are they doing now with the legislation that is before the House on labour hire loopholes? Once again, in spite of the fact that this will have a financial impact on some companies. We don't deny that, because we want workers to be paid properly. We don't want loopholes to be used in order to increase profits at the expense of workers being employed properly, at the expense of undermining enterprise bargaining.
The member for Hume.
The Leader of the Opposition made an assertion last week on radio, backed up by the Tactics Committee approving this question today, based upon a complete falsehood. A complete falsehood. A complete...
Order. Members on my left, the member for Page.
A complete falsehood, something of which they are very, very aware.
Give the call to the order. When the House comes to order, the Leader of the Opposition, the order. Members on my left, the Leader of the Opposition, the Leader of the House. When the House comes to order, I'll hear from the member for Reid.
My question is to the Treasurer. How is the Albanese Labor government working to get wages moving again, and what policies have been rejected?
Give the call to the Treasurer.
Thanks, Mr Speaker. We're very fortunate to work with the member for Reid, somebody who understands the pressures that people in her community are under, and a really important part of a team who said that we'd get wages moving again, and we are. And this is especially important at a time when people are under substantial cost of living pressure. Our plan is all about getting wages moving in a responsible and a sustainable way after a decade of stagnation from those opposite, and in ways that will help people deal with the price pressures in our economy. We are working for Australia, and we are delivering for working people. And we saw that in new analysis today, Mr Speaker. Average full-time earnings grew 3.9% over the first year of the Albanese government. This is the fastest rate of growth in a decade outside of the pandemic, and it is much more than the 2.4% average under those opposite. An average full-time worker was $3,700 better off in the first year of the Albanese government. That is $1,400 more than that would have been the case if they had got the wage increases under the wage stagnation of those opposite. Now, wage suppression was a deliberate design feature of those opposite, and that's why wages stagnated, not by accident but on purpose. It's what they wanted for working people. And when the member for Hume was asked about the changes we're making to industrial relations, he didn't support them because, and I quote, it would push wages up. It pushes wages up, Mr Speaker. Not for the first time the member for Hume said the quiet bit out loud. Now, Mr Speaker, we've taken a different approach and we're making progress. Pay rises for low-paid workers, pay rises for aged care workers, changing the laws to support secure jobs and better pay, changes to early childhood education to make it easier to work more and earn more, investing in TAFE to train people for higher wage opportunities, deepening and broadening our industrial base with an emphasis on the great jobs of the future. Now, Mr Speaker, we're pleased with the wages growth that we're seeing. It is making a difference, but Australians are still under significant pressure. That's why the primary focus of this government and this Prime Minister is rolling out billions of dollars in cost-of-living relief in ways that take the edge off inflation rather than add to it. We're seeing that in childcare and medicines and rent assistance and electricity bill relief that those opposite voted against. Mr Speaker, those opposite will never understand. They will never understand that when it comes to the pressures that people are under, decent wages growth is part of the solution and not part of the problem.
Give the call to the honourable member for Goldstein.
To the Minister for Climate Change and Energy. It's now nearly a year since the Parliament legislated a minimum target of a 43% reduction in carbon emissions by 2030. Given the latest public data shows Australia's overall emissions have gone up over that time, has the Minister received advice, formal or informal, that we're not on track to reach that 2030 emissions target?
Order. The member will ask her question again. The member for O'Connor and others interjecting knows it's highly disorderly when someone is asking a question. So just ask members to respect, well, to enable me to actually hear the question. Give the call to the member for Goldstein.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. To the Minister for Climate Change and Energy. It's now nearly a year since the Parliament legislated a minimum target of a 43% reduction in carbon emissions by 2030. Given the latest public data shows Australia's overall emissions have gone up over that time, has the Minister received advice, formal or informal, that we're not on track to reach that 2030 emissions target?
The call to the Minister for Climate Change and Energy.
Well, thank you very much, Mr Speaker. I thank the honourable member for the question. And she refers quite rightly to the public data released a few weeks ago, the quarterly projections for greenhouse gas emissions. They did show that emissions are up 0.1% over the year, or about 0.3% of a megatonne. Now, Mr Speaker, there was other data included in that. Electricity emissions were down 4%, which is a good thing as people take up more and more renewable energy. Fugitive emissions, which the honourable member is interested in, were down 1%. Stationary energy, mainly industry, was down just under 1%. Agriculture emissions were up 3%, which reflects... Agricultural emissions were up 3%, reflecting by and large a return to pre-drought conditions. And transport emissions were up 6%. Which really tells us a few things. It tells us that aviation is returning to pre-COVID levels, and it also underlines the need for more action on transport, which is why the Transport Minister has convened a Jet Zero Council to determine new and better ways for sustainable aviation fuel, and it's why the Transport Minister and I are working on fuel efficiency standards. Now, all this is very important.
Members on my left will cease interjecting.
Now, Mr Speaker, the honourable member referred to advice and the Climate Change Act. As the honourable member knows, the other thing incorporated in the Climate Change Act, which again I recognise she supported through the House, is an annual statement by me and the Minister of the Day to the Parliament on progress, both how we're going on emissions and the effectiveness of government policy. That must, under law, be supported by independent advice from the Climate Change Authority, which must be tabled at the same time. I have not yet received that advice. When it comes time for the annual statement, it will be tabled in accordance with the law later this year. That is the case. But, Mr Speaker, we do recognise on this side of the House that 43% is an ambitious target. It's achievable, but it's also ambitious. It won't happen in the absence of government action. And that's why not only are we implementing all the policies we took the election, but we've announced we'll implement sector plans as well, and that we have begun the process of setting the 2035 target. Now, Mr Speaker, some people spent the weekend debating whether climate change was real. Some people spent the weekend debating about whether they were committed to the bare minimum of action, net zero by 2050. They spent the weekend arguing about whether there's such a thing as climate change, Mr Speaker. We don't spend our time doing that. We spend our time getting on with implementing policies to reduce emissions, Mr Speaker. That's what the Albanese government does. Gets on with the job of implementing the mandate that we're elected to implement, Mr Speaker, reducing emissions, creating jobs of the future and implementing more renewable energy and getting emissions down, and that's the job we'll continue to do with no support from those opposite who can't agree on whether climate change is real or not.
Order. The member for Petrie will cease interjecting, so I can hear from the member for Bendigo.
Thank you, Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Employment and Workplace Relations. How is the Albanese Labor government delivering on its commitment to close loopholes and get wages moving? What impact has the changed approach to wages had on Australians' pay?
The call to the Minister to the Leader of the House.
Thanks so much, Mr Speaker. And I thank the member for Bendigo for the question, someone who's committed to getting wages moving and committed to jobs in her area. And an essential part of working for Australia is to get more people into work, is to make sure that they're paid more for it. Almost 500,000 jobs have been created under the Albanese Labor government, and around 85% of those new jobs have been full-time jobs. And from the analysis that's been released from Treasury today, the average increase in pay for a full-time worker is $10 a day. $10 a day. Now that's what happens. That's what happens where you no longer. I've got to say, I'm surprised the Shadow Treasurer is interjecting, Mr Speaker. On Thursday he walked out on his own speech. Just staged a walkout the moment it was time for him to speak. You've got a lot to say now, but not when it's your turn. Not when it's your turn. But that $10 a day, $10 a day, that doesn't happen by accident. It happens as a result of a government that no longer believes that low wages should be a deliberate design feature of management of the economy. $10 a day more because of change of government policy. $10 a day more because of a government with a Prime Minister that was willing to argue for an extra $1 an hour for the lowest paid in Australia. $10 a day more because of a government that was willing to front up and argue for increased pay for aged care workers. $10 a day more for a government that was willing to reform the bargaining system, the same reforms that the Shadow Treasurer opposed because he knew they would increase wages. $10 a day more for a government that banned pay secrecy clauses that they defended and voted to retain. $10 a day more for a government that had legislation to ban advertising a job for less than the legal minimum, and they still voted against that. But there are many workers who this still isn't reaching. Workers it's not reaching because they are in a situation where there are loopholes that their employers are using to make sure they don't even get the minimum standards. Workers in the gig economy where there are no minimum standards at all. Workers who work at places where there is an enterprise agreement in place, but they don't get the enterprise agreement rate because the relevant employer is using the labour hire loophole to undercut the rate. And employers who are willing to engage in wage theft, which should have been made a crime a long time ago, except they did the extraordinary thing of voting— sorry, Shadow Treasurer, it was the Liberal Party that voted against its own legislation in the Senate. Voted against their own legislation in the Senate.
Minister's time. The Minister for Home Affairs will cease interjecting. Before I call the Manager of Opposition Business, I'm just going to put the member for Hume, Petrie and Casey on warnings. The Manager on a point of order.
No, question.
Oh, my apologies. I give the call to the Manager of Opposition Business.
My question is to the Prime Minister. On 14 August this year, the Prime Minister attended a VIP Yes campaign event with former Qantas CEO Mr Alan Joyce. Was Qantas' support for the Yes campaign one of the factors that led to the government's decision to block the application for additional flights to and from Australia by
The manager will
Qatar.
pause. It is not going to work. The manager will just pause, resume his seat. Just resume his seat for a moment. The Attorney-General, question time will not operate with you interjecting on the question. You are warned. I don't know how much more serious I can make this. Questioners will not be interjected upon, no matter what the question is. Give the call to the Manager of Opposition Business, and he'll be heard in silence, or you won't be here to hear it.
My question is to the Prime Minister. On 14 August this year, the Prime Minister attended a VIP Yes campaign event with former Qantas CEO Mr Alan Joyce. Was Qantas' support for the Yes campaign one of the factors that led to the government's decision to block the application for additional flights to and from Australia by Qatar?
Give the call to the Prime Minister.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I was talking to, I thank the member for his question. I was talking to some of the journos this morning, and I know Claire Armstrong's made the effort to come here. She's the only one. Good on you, Claire. But we're talking about question time today, but this is not something I anticipated. Now, it might be news to the member for Bradfield that every major business in Australia is supporting a Yes campaign. Woolworths, Coles, Telstra, BHP, Rio Tinto, the Business Council of Australia, the Catholic Church, the Council of Imams, the Australian Football League, the National Rugby League, Rugby Australia, Netball Australia are all supporting a Yes campaign in this referendum. And I'll tell you who the VIPs were that day. They were the Indigenous workers, who I was proud to meet. Indigenous workers who I was proud to meet. And going back, of course, more than a decade, because the point is here that this referendum has been a long time coming. And planes have been painted with the R for recognise more than a decade ago. Just as planes were painted like Benalla Dreaming to pay respect to Indigenous Australians a long time ago. Companies are doing this because they understand. They've introduced reconciliation action plans. They have done so much. So many companies are doing good things, employing Indigenous Australians, particularly in regional Australia, it must be said. And that's a good thing. So it should be of no surprise whatsoever that along with a range of other businesses are all supporting the Yes campaign. And indeed, the Business Council of Australia have certainly spoken with me. Tim Reed, the President, was talking to me at the BCA dinner just a couple of weeks ago, was talking about the enormous support and how indeed there is such support across the business community for Yes, because they also know it's important for their businesses.
Concluded. Give the call to the honourable member for Bean.
Thanks, Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Aged Care. How is the Albanese Labor government helping support the aged care workforce to end the era of neglect and provide dignity to older Australians?
Give the call to the Minister for Aged Care and Sport.
I thank the member for Bean for his question and acknowledge his advocacy for workers in his electorate like Libby, Jamie and Junie at Goodwin Aged Care, which the Treasurer and I visited with him earlier this year to share the good news that those workers would be receiving a 15% pay rise above the award. Mr Speaker, the Albanese government has more than 100 aged care reform projects on the go at the moment, but perhaps our most important reform was to back those workers, to back the people who were left to languish by those opposite for 9 long years. And as the Prime Minister says, aged care workers deserve more than our thanks, they deserve a pay rise, and that is exactly what we gave them. We invested $11.3 billion to fund a 15% increase above the award for aged care workers to help attract and to retain staff. And this pay rise is having an immediate impact. Workers and staff at facilities like Eldercare Seaford and the Minister for Social Services electorate of Kingston have told us that they now see a career in aged care thanks to this pay rise. And we are hearing from providers, Mr Speaker, that every staff metric is now improving since this pay rise was introduced on the 1st of July. Staff attraction, staff retention, staff satisfaction are all trending upward since 1 July. And this shows our commitment to lifting wages. And today, the broad impact of our commitment was revealed, with the average full-time worker $3,700 better off than they were 1 year ago. The Australian Bureau of Statistics data detailed by the Treasurer today shows wages for a full-time worker increased 3.9% in the first year of the Albanese government. That is the fastest rate uptick in a decade, because our government cares about a fair day's work and a fair day's pay. Our government cares about getting wages moving again, and our government cares about rewarding the skilled, the demanding and the tireless workers in sectors like aged care, sectors where for too long they were told just to be happy to have a job at all. Just for too long they will be told to have a job that didn't reward them for the skills and the sophistication of the work that they did. Now, Mr Speaker, I acknowledge that there are many challenges in aged care, but with great challenge comes great opportunity. And unlike the previous government, we are confronting those challenges head-on and we are seizing the opportunities that come alongside them.
Yeah. Order. Call the Prime Minister.
I ask for further questions to be placed on the notice paper.